So my topic is about debt, and I want to say upfront, this is not Peter D Almeida's opinion. I'm not an economist. My knowledge of economy is only as a citizen. But I have taken extracts from three interesting discussions that I followed online and otherwise. One is a discussion that one of our journalists had with Yanis Varoufakis, who is the former finance minister of Greece, because he understands debt and all of that, because Greece went through a terrible problem. The second is a panel discussion, again online, in which I found two people very interesting. One is Professor Ulrich Volz from the University of London, and another gentleman whom I'll quote for a different reason, Mahesh Jain from a company called Hector Capital in Singapore. And the third, by far the most impactful discussion, was with a gentleman called Lee Buchheit, which was conducted by our echelon Shamindra Kulamanage in October of 2021. Just before these things came to light, completely broke down. He's an expert in negotiating debt. He has been in 40 years of experience. He's now called the godmother of debt because he does it free now. He consults with people, countries, because he has seen the harm and damage to countries' economies that have been caused by debt. So I'm just only quoting information I've got from them. And you can challenge that. So to start with, they all say, Professor Ulrich and Lee Buchheit say, you don't want to be in the situation that you are today in Sri Lanka. No country wants ever to be bankrupt. You understand that, no? A company doesn't want to be bankrupt. So he says, you are in a very bad place. You should not be here. So that's the problem. We start there. It's a crisis that we don't want to be in, so that's the first thing to understand. We've been brought into this. Secondly, when they ask them, how should you get out of, who bears the pain? Without any batting an eyelid, Lee Buchheit said both equally. Because he says, and that's the point, any debt is serviceable. Any debt is serviceable if you are willing to pay the price. And he jokingly says, if they sell the Acropolis in Greece to BlackRock, then you raise money. So if you sell the Dalada Maligava and the Sigiri and all that, it's all sustainable. So that's the question to ask ourselves. And then he goes on to explain, Lee Buchheit says, our problem is this. We have four types of creditors we have borrowed money from. One is the international sovereign bond, which is commercial, private entities. We don't know who the actual owners of the bond are because they're bought by companies like BlackRock and them, so that's private. Those are commercial debt. The second is a group called the OECD countries, which is the Paris Club. Largely our creditor from that club is Japan. So that's another type of debt. Third is this thing called bilateral, which is Sri Lanka, Japan, Sri Lanka, China, Sri Lanka, India. Some of that debt is not actually government debt because there are things like Exim Bank, they are owned by the Chinese government, but they are commercial debt, which means they are borrowed at very high interest rates, a short period of repayment, right? Then you get the World Bank and IMF and all that. He says, let's park them for a while, ADB and all that, because those debt we can renegotiate. They're very low interest, long payment term. So don't worry about it for the time being, says Lee Buchheit. Then he comes to this problem about the three types of creditors. I think the debt with those countries, foreign debt, is about $30 billion. Now, firstly, when you are bankrupt, they want to know how bankrupt are you. They want a credible report. Now, those guys don't trust the IMF, but for the time being, Lee Buchheit says they'll accept the IMF study as the actual basis on which the negotiations start to happen. So we are up against problem number one. He says the Chinese are not transparent in their loans, and the IMF report talks about that. And as a result, the IMF study itself, when they say, here is your debt sustainability situation, they look at that with a lot of suspicion. But for whatever reason, they might accept it, and that negotiation is happening now. So you start off with a problem. Secondly, this IMF, what does it do in their debt sustainability report? He says they do only two things. One is they give you a set of guidelines you need to follow, harsh monetary and fiscal condition they'll impose on you, which is already now coming out slowly. Then they have already said that your debt is not sustainable, you need to get relief. which means you need to go to your creditors and they'll tell you roughly how much you need to cut from them. We don't know what that amount is. Countries like Ecuador, they said 40%. You have to go and cut. That's all they'll tell you. How you do it, from where you cut it, that's your problem. Now remember the 2.9 billion that President and others are talking about? That is all subject to these two things happening. It's not come. So all of those who thought that the President has come and everything will be fine, that's not the case. According to these experts, not Peter D Almeida. These are people who have negotiated these days. Now, they take this and go to these three types of creditors. They all say one thing. We want common terms. In other words, you cannot tell the OECD Paris Club to take a cut of whatever IMF has told you to cut. They will say, we'll do it provided all the others agree. Okay? So there are only three ways in which debt can be restructured. One is you have to get a haircut, as they call it. You have to cut the amount. I owe Japan 12 billion. Japan will say, okay, guys, I'll take 8. Second, lower the interest rate. Third, reprofiling, which means you pay it back over a longer period of time. So first is you try to go for this haircut. Already, China has said, no haircut. Match over, no? So what do you write? They already said that. You're in the papers. No haircut. We'll reduce the loan interest. We'll give you more money to pay the interest, and we'll pay it over a longer period of time. Ecuador's just reached agreement with China, by the way, on those terms, not haircut, as far as I know. So then the others say, go to hell. So this goes round and round and round, he says, these negotiations, because they are not come together at the same table. And then there's China, India, all those rivalries. Because I don't want to get played out, no? If I owe you Tikshana, you say, okay, Machan, I'll take a cut. I find that I've gone and paid the whole loan to Tilak. So you don't want to be taken for a fool. So this, he says, Lee Buchheit says, at the very least, it will take as little as 11 months. Now we have a situation where the president has shot off and said that Japan is going to bring about all these parties together. Within 1 hour, the Japanese government said, no such thing. It's wishful thinking. That's your wishful thinking. Now what did we go and do to Japan? When Japan told us, the Japanese ambassador said, your minister asked for a bribe or a commission. The Japanese, for them, honor is a big deal, no? The Japanese ambassador tells you, you have to take it seriously. What did we do? The new president appoints a commission. You know what these commissions are like. They find him not guilty, and he's back in power. You think the Japanese are going to like that? And the Japanese are very patient people. They don't scream and shout. Because there are 300 ways in Japan to say no, no. You know that. They don't say no. For example, Ramesh, if they tell us apparently, you can be sure that your request will get the highest consideration of a board in Japanese, it means no. So the Japanese fellow will come out and say no. Sri Lankan fellow say, Shawu mara machamu board ekadat kiyanolu. So Japanese will bide their time. And they'll say, no, come talk about the loan now. You have embarrassed us publicly. So this is what we are up against. This is not going to happen anytime soon. And the IMF has also said very interesting things. Corruption. Now I made a note of this. In their report, there are 7 points, and GL Peiris is talking about it now. I wonder where he was when all this was happening. You must listen to them. It's amazing. You think, my God, these people were there fighting for us. They say, one of the points that they make is fiscal transparency, public financial management, and laws and policies to reduce corruption vulnerabilities. Now, the same thing has been said by the US Senate. The Senate has passed a law saying, go after corruption. So are the Japanese, because they are light railway, you know what happened. Now they are going to insist on that. This is why anybody who felt that the appointment of the new president is going to produce magic, you're going to be in for a great surprise. Because they are not dealing with corruption, like Ruanti pointed out. So The point I'm making is we are in a very, very difficult financial situation. So then they ask ourselves, now listen to what, this is where I want to bring in Manesh Jain. He says, we are venture capital and capital, like Hector Capital Company. We have the money, first point he said. And I'm quoting him word to word. He says, and mark this, he says, we look at you with greed. In that seminar, we look at you with greed. Because we want your assets, a risk-adjusted, attractive risk-adjusted return. Then he goes on to say, we are expecting a fire sale price. And Walsh says, it's a bad idea to sell your assets when you're in trouble. You know this, no? Because when you're in trouble, you say, Danwane Kitsi, they'll say, Macha Aru Peter, Idamak Vikuno, Macha U Batila inne. Honda Gana Ganda Pula. Cash General Maja Tava Millionaire Kadukaranapula. So that's what happened in Greece. They sold their assets to China. And they're suffering. Because you need assets to recover, no? Companies, you all run companies, you sell your assets, how are you going to recover? So he says, don't do that. Bad idea. And especially when a corrupt government does, it's even worse. That's the point. So he said, this is not the way to do it. So what does Lee Buchheit say? What does Yanis Varoufakis says? In fact, Yanis Varoufakis said, these guys have you exactly where they want you to be. This is not accidental. I mean, 3 years ago, IMF said we are in a bad state. They still gave us loans. So he says, they want you exactly where you are because they don't need your money. They want your assets and your resources. They don't want our miserable money. They have money. This is what they want. The ilmenite and other things that we spoke about. And there'll be corrupt guys who will give it to the lowest bidder. So this is the crisis. So what did Greece do? What did Yanis Varoufakis do? This is where Ruanti's point, you mobilize the people on the streets to go and have these negotiations. Because he says, his own words, he has to use carrot and stick. Carrot, then who is going to wield the stick against the creditors? He says, the creditors are equally responsible. Because when Shamindra Kulamanagi asked, who bears the pain? Without batting an eyelid. And Lee Buchheit is not a Marxist. He said both sides equally. Because if you have been an irresponsible borrower, there has been an irresponsible lender. We go to them and say, why did you give money to build the Lotus Tower? I'm sorry, we can't pay it. And there are millions of our people on the streets. As we saw in the protest, I represent them. Now, when you have a government that's not representative of the people, that has crushed the people, then how do you go to negotiate? Even when we go for a strike negotiation, we go with some strength, no? So there is not that. So that's what happened in Greece. They had a referendum. 62% rejected the IMF terms. And the IMF agreed with Yanis Varoufakis because he came up with a formula. For the first time, he said, you help to grow GDP. As much as we grow the GDP, proportionately higher amount we'll pay in debt. The IMF agreed. The IMF agreed. But the Dutch and German banks said no. This is what will happen. Our creditors will say, we can't accept that. So you see, we're in a problem. Now, the problem is compounded if it comes to local banks. If the local banks, some of the local banks own foreign debt, right? Remember that. Very high percentages, some as much as 12% of their portfolio of foreign denominated loans. If they insist on a haircut on local banks, particularly local state-owned banks, what happens? He calls that the doomsday cycle. If our local banks take haircuts, their assets drop, their balance sheet goes, the government has to pump back the money, says Lee Buchheit, to keep the banks afloat. Whatever you have saved from foreign countries as haircuts, you put back into local banks. You see the problem they brought us to. This is not a joke. So that is what we are up against. And we think it's all okay. So I just want to, you have to think about this. My time is up. Just to understand that you need a strong negotiating team that has the backing of the people, that has credibility, to go and have these talks. And he says it can be done. There are countries that have taken 40% haircuts. It can be done. But who is going to do it? We don't have the capacity of a government that represents no one. to go and have these conversations. And as Rwanti said, you did not harness the struggle of the people and say, my people out on the street, guys, you tell me, let's talk. And he says these talks happen all the time in New York with banks in New York. The companies go to banks and say, reprofile your credit. He says it happens all the time. It's nothing unusual. But we don't have the capacity to do it. Now we'll go like beggars with begging bowls. We are not beggars, So I'll stop there and we can have a discussion later. Just to tell you that we need transparency. That's the other thing, because you see, the terms of the IMF loan, and why is the government not transparent? Why? It's our situation. Now, when we were in the trade union movement, every negotiation we come back and report to our committees. Every negotiation. In fact, in some countries, some of the farmers and all that, they say when you go to negotiate, have a mic, loudspeakers outside, and we can hear what you are saying because you're going to talk about us. Now they are not talking about. Why is that? Why are you not transparent? That's the other thing you're going to insist. Transparency, let us know what you're talking about so that we can be a part of trying to understand how and get expertise from people like this. They will come and see how can we come back with the resources and things that we have. We have a way of pulling ourselves back. So let's see how we can intervene on an important matter like this without being indifferent to it. Thank you.